Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming back to another Workshop Wednesday. I am Jennifer Slattery with the League of Cities and Towns, and today we're excited to have Ashley Selima with us from the Rhode Island Department of State. And Ashley's going to talk to us as a encore presentation. I asked her to come back. She had presented this at our convention, but certainly a worthwhile presentation that probably not everybody got to go to. So about records management and what cities and towns need to know. So I'll turn it over to you, Ashley. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Good morning. Happy to be here. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Show everybody what we got going on. There we go. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, Jen, and for having me here today, and for my encore presentation from what we shared at your annual meeting. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about effective records and information management, which I know excited and records management don't sound like they go together, but it's a really effective tool in your tool belt for day-to-day work. So I'm happy to be able to offer you that advice and resources to help you just continue on and add best practice to your day-to-day. Before I go into the fullness of our presentation, just in case you aren't aware of our office and what we do, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the Public Records Administration itself. The Public Records Administration oversees records management functions within both state and local government, including the Local Government Records Program, and all of that is in Rhode Island General Law 38.3. We provide records management standards and advice as well as regulatory authority. We have a couple of regulations that would be very helpful to you. We also manage the offsite storage contract for public records. Currently, that contract is with Iron Mountain, and we work on the RFP process to help lock in that fair pricing statewide. And three, we also help with historic preservation assistance and advice because the Public Records Administration is underneath the umbrella of the state archives, and we work hand in hand for the management of public records that are day-to-day business records that have shorter retentions all the way through to advice on those permanent records of state and local government and how to care for them properly. So jumping into the meat of our presentation, we're going to first do a quick overview of managing public records, which the best and most important question to start with is, what are public records? So when you're evaluating things that you are working with, you always want to be asking yourself two very core questions. Number one, as it says here, do the contents concern official business? Very likely the answer to that question is yes. And question two, is it maintained by a public body? Public body meaning any agency, department, division, subdivision. If it is being maintained and documenting the official business of that body, then it is a public record. Public records are subject to records retention laws, which means they must be kept for a certain amount of time before requesting destruction, and they're also beholden to APRA. So even if something is exempt under APRA for production to the public, it is still a public record and has to be cared for appropriately. So that's the difference between maybe an open and a closed record. They are still considered public records because they're created in the course of public business. The other note we always like to make is that public records are format neutral, which effectively just means that the record is defined by its content and its function, not the medium in which it's created. So a photograph can just as much be, or is just as much, a public record as a memo, depending on the purpose. For example, the State Archives maintains photographs from DOT's historic bridge projects, and we have photos from when they were going through and doing the archaeology digs. Or we also have photographs from DEM Parks and Rec, which were documenting the activity of the Parks and Rec department and division at that time. So even though it might be a more fun-looking record, it's still a record and needs to be preserved properly based on its function and its content for your agency. As an agency, we are always responsible for a few things. First and foremost, creating and maintaining records that fully document all of the legally mandated activities of that office. That could include policies, decisions, transactions. If we think for like a clerk's office, that's maintaining records of license applications or vital records. Those things are all public records of some kind that we're creating and caring for. Number two is knowing what you have and how to treat them and how to store them. The knowing what you have is one of the most important pieces because it's you can't provide something that you can't find. And that's where we slide into number three, which is organizing your records efficiently for current and future accessibility. Doing records management now, as we're going to explore in this presentation, is doing a favor to future you and whoever may come after you. And lastly, as an agency, we're always responsible for disposing of records in accordance with the Associated Records Retention Schedule. So records cannot be destroyed if they are not on a schedule, and they must be identified by their schedule in order to request destruction. I'll go through the actual destruction process a little later on, but the very shorthand version is there's a form that you fill out that you identify the record and how long it's been maintained, and that it's been maintained the proper amount of time. And then our office signs off on that, and then those records can be destroyed. The paper form that you submit becomes the permanent replacement. As I said, I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that process, but I like to highlight it up top right here because it's an important part of the process, and it feels, especially if it's something you haven't worked too much in, like an unnecessary or added step. But it actually is intended to protect all agencies and the public to make very clear that records were handled properly, that if records were destroyed, they were destroyed at the proper time, and that form proves that good custodianship for you. So that's why that form exists. At a very top level, what is records management? And it is simply just the control and maintenance of documenting the day-to-day work of business. Like what is the function of your office, and then documenting that effort like we had in point one in the previous slide. So records management applies to that organization and maintenance for every kind of record you produce, whether it be paper, a digital file, a floppy disk, if you've been around for a while. Because they're format neutral, it's just about having control of those things that you both create and receive. As a little bit of an organizational nerd, if I can say that here, this is one of my favorite slides in our entire presentation because I think we very often overcomplicate records management. We think it has to be this very lofty ideal, but I always like to bring it back down to distill it to that it is just organization and knowing what you have and knowing where it is. And these are some of the tools that help us do that. It can be a file plan, it can be an index, either physical or digital, a controlled vocabulary, which the records retention schedule gives you controlled vocabulary for that clarity and succession planning from person to person. You know what it means because you can always reference the schedule. Taxonomies, again, that's a consistency of language. Data dictionaries, and then the records control schedule, which can help with all of those things listed above. There are a lot of tools that you can use, and I hope that you found some that are most effective for your agency because good records management helps you now, helps you in the future, and it also just makes your jobs a lot easier. When we zoom out and focus on the overall byproduct of records management, good records management obviously has really positive implications for everything that we're all doing as agencies and government employees, right? It helps preserve agency knowledge. It helps everybody properly perform the core mission because all of the information they need is locatable. It effectively retrieves and disposes of records, which means that you're not getting rid of anything too soon and out of compliance, but it also means you're not unnecessarily storing something and losing money through the storage cycle when you don't have to. And last, it helps ensure regulatory compliance, right? It shows that you're being a good steward as your job in that agency continues forward. On the contrary, poor records management obviously has negative impacts. First and foremost, it can infer legal penalties for failure to locate or produce records. That could be APRA, that could be discovery, could be any number of things. Number two, which to me I think is one of the highest, is it loses public trust. If we're unable to produce the records that are being requested, if there's not documentation of a process that there should be, it makes it difficult for the public to trust the good work that we're all doing. And three, it can incur really severe costs for remediation if a record became damaged through lack of care and must be remediated because it hasn't met retention yet. A record becoming damaged does not inherently mean it can just be tossed. Because these records have government value and value to the people of the state, and they help document the purposes and what we're doing with our time and state funding, they have to be maintained for their proper retention. So sometimes lack of care actually becomes very, very costly because you have to do restoration, especially if those records are permanent value. Very sad to say that these two photos on this slide are real life examples that the local government records coordinator experienced a handful of times over the course of their 30-year career here with the state. But I will say with like genuine encouragement that each of these instances were then able to be turned around, and they worked with our office and their internal policies and procedures to make improvements from this point, right? So there is always a pathway to achieving better practice, if not best practice. We're always scaffolding and stacking on what exists and seeing how we can make improvements and how our office can help you make those improvements. In order to avoid the things in those photos, these are really the top four things you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about storing your records. So you want it to be secure. You don't want just anyone to be able to walk into a room and walk out with a file, never to be seen again. You want to ensure that it's a dry space. So you don't want to be storing boxes of records under pipes, near sinks, near anything that has to do with plumbing or utilities, because if there is an emergency in those areas, then you have a higher likelihood of those records becoming damaged. Three, you want to keep it clean, right? So basements and attics have a much higher risk of things like pests or dust and all of those things that can contaminate a record. So they're not the top location when storing records. However, you do want to keep it isolated, right? So you don't want to be storing Christmas decorations with your boxes of records. You want to have a designated area for those records that is clean, easily accessed by the right people, but closed off to the people like the public who should not have access, and accessible in the sense that everything can be locatable. When you're storing and organizing your records in that designated storage space, these are kind of our do and do nots, right? We want to pack like with like. You want to have records that are of the same record series and function stored together, especially the same retention period, because then it's much easier when you're preparing for destruction. You always want to folder and box the records, which goes back to records identification, but forward to that clearly labeling folders and boxes according to the records retention schedule, because that's immediate and easy ID. You know exactly what it is, you know exactly its contents, and how to handle it. And as much as possible, you want to use standard size record storage boxes, which are those 1.2 cubic foot boxes that you can get from Iron Mountain, Staples, WB Mason. And that standardization makes for better storage. You can stack them a couple high if you need to. But the fact that the bottom is separate from the lid also means that if the lid becomes damaged but the box is in good shape, you can replace the lid and not have to go through the entire process of relocating, I apologize, the materials of the box. The other thing about using files and folders is it helps with that identification. You don't want to be just throwing loose papers into a box because again, that's just creating a problem for future you or future someone else to try to figure out what they are. Which goes to the first on our do not here. So don't store unidentified files. You don't want to be mixing different retention periods in a box because if you do that, the box will need to be kept as long as the longest retention. So if you put something in there that has a 3-year retention, but something that has a 10-year retention, if you want to destroy the entire box at one time, you have to wait for that 10-year trigger. We recommend that you don't use large boxes like the banker's boxes or odd-shaped boxes like copy paper because copy paper boxes aren't meant to support records in the long term. They're not like hardy enough. And banker's boxes, while they can be hardy, they get to be over 60 or up to 80 pounds when they're full. And because of that, they bow in the middle, which makes it hazardous to the records, but also from a human experience, hazardous to our backs to try to lift those records up. So you don't want to overfill boxes or folders. You don't want to use boxes that are too large. It's kind of that Goldilocks syndrome of that 1.2 cubic foot box that is manageable for one person and when cleanly organized, very easily accessible. This slide here is simply the 10 commandments, right, of records management, which we actually pulled from and adapted. And you'll see down the bottom of the slide here from a federal resource. But I liked the way that this was very easy to kind of pull out those keywords that we want to talk about for records management, right? You want to identify the functions. You want to create records that document the actual processes of your agency, your office, your division. You want to maintain things in a way that you can find and retrieve them. You want to remove or destroy records only with proper authorization. You want to keep official records separate from non-record materials, right? That's again goes back to clearly knowing what you have, keeping your permanent records separate from your transitory shorter retention records. You want to make someone responsible for your records program. You want to have a subject matter expert or a records custodian that can help with these things. You want to transfer records identified as permanent as properly or to the proper location within your storage. You want to protect vital records based on their value. So we work with the city and town clerks quite a lot. They have separate storage spaces for their vital records because they are permanent and they're actually, accessed very frequently by their constituents. So those types of vital records, absolutely, but also records that are vital to business, right? Those essential records. You want to make sure have that extra layer of protection that they may need. You also want to have the proper storage space to contain sensitive information with appropriate safeguards, and you want to do all of this as cost effective as possible. So these are the 10 commandments of records management, which sounds kind of silly, but it really breaks down and distills for us that identify, create, maintain, and keep that is foundational to the overall discussion we're having today. Moving forward, now that we've covered just like the general records management, I wanted to spend a little bit exploring knowing your records, which I've hinted at as we've gone through the first couple of slides. And the first thing to help you with knowing your records is that records retention schedule that I've abstractly mentioned a few times already so far. So what is a records retention schedule? Excuse me. The records retention schedule is a document that identifies the function of a record, the type of records that is created, and the minimum amount of time a record must be retained or kept before requesting destruction. So it is effectively the perfect inventory tool for knowing what you have, how long it needs to be kept, and when it can be appropriately disposed of. Right now, there are a few different kinds of schedules that we have published for use. So the first set is the general retention schedules. There are 9, and they can be used by all state and local agencies as appropriate. There are agency-specific retention schedules, which are specific to executive branch agencies. Quasi-retention schedules, which again are exclusive for quasi-state agencies, and that's specifically for fiscal and personnel records. And then lastly, probably the most interesting to those of you on this call, the local government retention schedules or LG schedules. And those are used specifically for local government agencies and various departments within, right? So there is a LG schedule for clerks, LG1, but there's also an LG for police, for fire. Housing authorities is LG18. So the LG schedules break out based on that function within municipal government. The records retention schedules are built based on inventories. So our office always works with subject matter experts to create an inventory that we then build from so that the understanding always begins with the subject matter expert and the function. And in that inventory, we ask for what kind of records are created and received, what's the purpose of them or the function, including the content of what can be found in the files, and then the anticipated amount of time that it would be kept. So when we are talking with our subject matter experts at all of the municipal offices that work with us, that comes down to how long is it needed for day-to-day business. So we understand from a business perspective how long, and then that kind of draft is reviewed and assessed for historic value by the state archives, legal value by the Attorney General's office, and fiscal value by the Auditor General's office. And that's how sometimes if you've worked with us before and you've been a part of this process, you may see that a draft may have one retention, but the final has a slightly longer or slightly shorter retention period, and that's due to that ongoing discussion between those 3 offices. The retention schedules themselves contain record series. So the schedule is the comprehensive name for the document. So LG1 is the schedule for clerks. But within that, there are dozens of record series that are specific to the functions within. So a record series is a group of records all with the same purpose that document the same activity. So the way our schedules work, there will always be a record series number and a record series title, a record series description, and then the minimum required retention period. I tend to stress the minimum part of the retention period because for certain records in some offices, records may be kept a little bit longer, but the retention schedule tells you legally the minimum, the least amount of time it has to be kept to be compliant before seeking destruction. If we think back to the idea of an inventory and working from the inventory spreadsheet forward to the final schedule, this is how it moves along, how it kind of changes and looks. So the record series in the inventory is like the title of the record. So we come up with the record series name based on what we see in the inventories provided. And the descriptions help tell us the purpose. So I just have an example here for you. So the record series title being inspections. We want to know the function and the included types of records. So we have inspection reports. And then this one is actually broken down into subseries. Reports of inspections made biannually, or may include but isn't not limited to notations, action taken, thing like that. And then in the retention, we have this one does not have a straight retention, it has a trigger. So 10 years after demolished or replaced. So retention periods tend to have either a straight retention, 3 years, a trigger like this one. So those will say after demolished, after audit, after close of contract. Those are the two primary types of retentions that we use. More often than not, it's a straight retention because that's a lot easier to interpret, but you do see the ones with the triggers kind of throughout the retention schedules. So knowing your records by using the retention schedules then leads you into organizing your records using them. So to maintain that consistency, you would use that information when you're filing. So on your file folders, you can have the record series title or subseries title, depending, division, if applicable, the office within the town, and then received date, the record name and number, or destruction date. You can have all of that information on the folder so that it's immediately clear what the contents are. And as you're building this structure, using the same structure for your digital files as your physical files is very helpful for your own access points and for any future person. But again, having this records management is also about making it actually feel manageable. It's not just management from it's a task to do, it is to make your own day-to-day more manageable and doable because you're not hunting through multiple file cabinets for one piece of paper. I apologize. My office is quite dry today. When you're doing your digital files, this is our advice for file naming, and that is to keep it as short as you can, but you want the name to be meaningful. You want to have the most important information first and use leading zeros if you know you're going to have a lot of different versions potentially. You don't want to overwrite extensions because then you could lose some different versions of the record. But above all, you want to be consistent, right? So short and meaningful, but consistent, and always have version control so that you don't lose your work. When you're packing up paper records, there's a few things to keep in mind, which we've touched a little bit on already. So I'm going to buzz by this one a little bit simply by saying the packing best practice is to label everything, don't overfill the box. And then the last two here are the keys I want to focus on, which is pre-fill the CRDs for future submissions, which is one of the best pieces of advice we like to offer. So that destruction form is called the Certification of Records Destruction, or CRD. And you can pack the box full of records and then fill out the CRD with everything except for the submission date and your signature and pack it at the front of the box so that you know what's in the box. And when it's ready to do destruction, you just pull out the CRD, you sign it, and then you submit it to our office for approval. So you're not having to go through the box a little bit at a time to identify what goes on that form. You've already done the work while you're packing it. Saves you a step in the future. And then the same work on the outside of the box, just label it with the contents and the year span. And again, with that retention for like the expected destruction date so that you're already doing the work ahead of time. When you're storing them, use that standard size box we talked about, but also keep records off the floor. That will help protect one risk category for water coming up if your records are not on the floor. So at the very least, we recommend pallets. But maximize using vertical shelving can be incredibly helpful, both from an access perspective, but also from a risk assessment perspective. And then shelving should be 18 inches below the sprinklers or 3 to 4 inches off the floor. Again, in both cases to protect from water. The good thing about those record storage boxes that we talked about is the lids are a little bit larger than the box. So while they're still made of that kind of like cardboard with some tenacity, for lack of a better term there, the water will go over the box. So as long as it's addressed quickly enough, the box will do the job of protecting anything within from water, but you want to avoid water altogether if you can because it is still cardboard. When we're talking about storing records and knowing what you have from the digital perspective, you want to use those file naming conventions for consistency. You want to have a designated location, whether that be shared drive or a backup. There's a principle in digital archiving and digital preservation called LOCKSS, which sounds very serious, but it just stands for lots of copies keep stuff safe. So especially for your essential records, your vital records, having multiple copies, especially if you are talking about long-term retentions, having more than one copy and having a backup is very important. You want to keep an eye out for obsolescence, and then you just want to maintain use and access copies. So for example, if you have records that are of a long-term or even a permanent retention, but you want to have a scanned copy, you can scan a copy for access use and maintain the paper for that permanent and long-term preservation, but not have to access the paper frequently because you've made a digital copy for access. So it doesn't replace the physical record, but it does give you a much more accessible pathway for the information if you want to go that route. Now that we've talked about what is records management and knowing our records, I wanted to go through what the phases of the record life cycle are. Because every single record we create or produce moves through these phases, and it's not always in the same phase as we're working. So first and foremost, it's like the create and receive stage. When you either receive a record from the public or create a record, that's the very first thing that has to happen. That's the beginning of the documentation cycle. Then it enters into being the use and file, where it's still in an active phase. It's not quite long-term storage, but it's not necessarily sitting on your desk, right? So that use and file stage, it's still active, it's still maybe access for day-to-day business, but you don't need it all the time. Third is storing per the retention schedule. So that's for that part of the life cycle where it's no longer needed for day-to-day business, but it hasn't met its retention yet. So it has to be maintained for that time period. So that's phase 3, which is almost cold storage. And then last is that transfer or disposition, right? So preserve it permanently. When it's no longer needed for day-to-day business, move it into that permanent preservation. Or if it's proper to destroy per the retention schedule and go through the destruction process. So records need to be actively maintained and be custodians of them through every phase of the life cycle until that ending disposition. How do you know what phase it's in? It's based on your agency's needs, right? It's based on your day-to-day business. So if you are using a record and you know you're going to be frequently accessing it, that's very early in the life cycle. But if it's something that after a period of time, you're not accessing it every day or even every week or every month, then that's probably entering into the storage phase. So it's all based on the needs of your office and your agency and what that access point needs to be. One of the best tools that we talked about very early on, but not in detail, is using an inventory to identify your records. The reason we recommend that is because it standardizes workflow, it helps increase efficiency, it centralizes your information so that you and any colleague can find a record if you need to. It limits the risk of loss because you know what you have and where it's supposed to be, and it limits the risk of improper destruction because, again, you know what it is and where it is. So an inventory or a file plan is effectively giving you a snapshot of what you're responsible for so that you know how to properly care for it. When you get towards the end of the life cycle and it's time to seek that destruction, This is the description of that form I was telling you about, which is the Certification of Records Destruction, or CRD. So each CRD, you have multiple lines that you can add in, or fill in, I should say. And each time it's required to have the record series number and title and name so that we know what you're seeking to destroy. The date or date span, right? So if you are seeking to destroy the records from 2010 to 2020, you can just put 2010 to 2020 in that date span box. You don't have to list each individual year. You would then put the volume, either in cubic footage or number of boxes and files. For state agencies, they verify that it's never been in the state record center. For municipal government, that's a box you can skip, and it says so on the form that it's exclusive to state agencies. But there is a box for you to check to verify that all of the conditions have been met. The reason we ask for that is because of those retentions that have a trigger that we have no way of perfectly authenticating other than through your confirmation. So that an audit has occurred, a building has been demolished. So that's your confirmation that that trigger has happened, and now going forward, you confirm that they're ready for destruction. And then the last step, obviously, is to sign it and then send it to us for final review. And then for me, or in the future, a different state archivist and public records administrator to sign. And we do that on your behalf just to double check and to help make sure that that compliance factor is there so that everything is documented as it should be, and to make sure that all the right years are there so that we can help you in that detailed nature. So we always double check everything on your behalf, and then we'll sign and send back. Or if we have questions, we'll coordinate with you directly. When it comes to that disposition, though, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind all the time. You need to appropriately dispose of them, right? So if we're thinking about paper, especially if it has PII, if you're going through the destruction, then you need to be doing shredding or other types of physical destruction, not simply throwing it in the recycle bin necessarily. That may be appropriate for some destruction, but certainly not all. You need to remember if there are any legal holds on records before you're going forward to seek destruction authorization. Always double check with your solicitor or legal counsel that there's nothing that's tied up in an APRA or other hold. You want to collect and maintain any of the indexing information and note in an index or an inventory if a record is being scheduled for destruction. And then maintain the metadata about the records, the information about what you had. And that CRD form, which is here, is a form of that metadata. It gives you the information about the information and about what you destroyed and when. So this form on the slide is the permanent replacement. So if somebody came to you and said, well, why don't you have this record from 2012? But if you went through the process, you submitted the CRD, you would then be able to produce this form and say, it was legally eligible for destruction. This is the permanent replacement. We were compliant to destroy that record. And that's the answer. That's the end of the conversation. You've gone through the process properly as the law states. So that's what this form is for. It is there for your agency's protection and also the documentation so that you know the activity that's been done. You always keep a copy of this form permanently, but so does the state archives, the local government records program. We also keep a copy because it's a record of something that we have approved. I'm going to slide in very briefly to say about the records life cycle and when something is potentially subject to APRA. Now, we are not the office that oversees APRA, but we are the office that oversees the records management piece, and you can't produce what you don't have. So we want to give a little bit of advice in this corner here. So from looking through, and you can speak with the Attorney General's office for more specifics, but any record maintained by a public body can be subject to APRA, even if it's a record that's in storage. So again, it's important to know what you have and where it is. And regardless of whether the retention schedule would have permitted destruction, if the records are still being maintained, they're subject to APRA. So for example, if you have a record that had a retention of 5 years, but it's been 7 years, but you never sought destruction, even though it was eligible previously, if you still have it, it's still subject. You can't suddenly seek to destroy that record. We're going to go through step by step in the 4 different phases of the life cycle to talk about a few considerations that we want to have, right? So when you're in that create and receive phase of the record's life cycle, be familiar with the schedule, organize and label for that easy ID, because when it comes to APRA, when you're organizing your records and they're readily accessible, it's a lot faster to answer the appropriate APRA request and identify what you have and what you don't. And an important consideration is to ensure that everybody in your organization knows about the requirements of APRA, including where it can apply, right? What devices we're using, where the records are, all important in the create and receive part of the cycle. So again, use your schedule, organize and label, be aware of where your records are so that it's easier to produce them if necessary. Very similar recommendations here in the use and file, that still fairly active phase of the record's life cycle. Keep them organized. When you pull a record, put it back where you got it so you always know where it is. If records are unorganized, it takes time, but it's better to organize them ahead of time so you're not scrambling for day-to-day business or in the instance of an APRA request. And anyone in the agency should be able to locate the records, not just you. If you're in a situation where only one person knows where everything is, we're setting ourselves up for a headache, right? Because when we have our APRA considerations, unorganized or misplaced records only make fulfilling an APRA harder, whereas organizing based on retention schedules can assist in timely search. You know exactly what it is, where it is, how long it's been there. And we would also recommend working with IT staff to determine ways to organize your digital records for easier and efficient searching. Because it feels like digital should be faster, but that is not always true, especially if the organization isn't there. Which is why earlier I recommended using the same structure of organization for physical as you do for digital, because then you know what you're looking for, no matter what medium you're in. In the storage phase, this advice is very consistent throughout. It's just about how it's being used. So when you're boxing up records for storage, organize them based on record series from the retention schedules. Maintain records that you know will be frequently accessed on site, right? So prioritize what goes off site based on likely access and likely need. But if there is something that's ineffective or inactive, you can send into offsite storage. For state agencies, that would be at the State Record Center, but municipalities can also use a contract for Iron Mountain just with less direct involvement from our office. You still get the pricing for the MPA if that is something that's of interest to you. Either way, though, packing records for being designated to an area that's less accessed can be done with or without offsite storage. Just be mindful of what goes where and that you know where it is, what either in your inventory or other documentation. From an APRA perspective, in that ease of responding, on-site records are obviously quicker and easier to produce. For agencies, I wanted to put an example here that offsite records at the State Record Center can take 1 to 2 business days to come back, which isn't too long, but when you're thinking about offsite storage, that is an indicator on your timeline. And you always want to ensure that all pertinent information associated with a box offsite or stored elsewhere is easy for future retrieval. So again, inventory, index, file plan, some form of documentation so you know what you have and where it is. And finally, at the end of the record's life cycle, you always need to consult the schedules, determine when they're eligible, and then go through that CRD process, which I'm not going to repeat for you again. But whereas it comes to APRA, you need to recognize that records can't be submitted for destruction after an APRA has been received. You'd have to wait until after that had closed out. The other helpful piece of information, though, is sometimes with an APRA, if they're seeking a record and it's been properly destroyed and you have that CRD, your response to the APRA may be that CRD. And that is a helpful tool in that situation. So again, that documentation is the purpose of that form. Thinking about use of an inventory in this conversation and in the phases of the life cycle, it does a few things that we've already established, but I just wanted to summarize for you here. It helps maintain intellectual control. It helps when the use and identification of them using the retention schedules, because it's that built-in kind of inventory language in the schedules. And you can also locate records quickly by using your own agency inventories, whether that be in office or other offsite. And as I mentioned two slides ago, the CRD is that additional tool for double checking if a record was destroyed at the proper time, because that may be the answer. And it also, not even just for APRA, but in general, if a record isn't found, going through and double checking for a digital version or past destruction authorizations can help narrow down location of a record, where it is, where it wasn't, where it's been. It's a really effective tool for that. So always keep your CRDs together as well. Have a specific file location for those so that you always know what's been destroyed and when and by whom. If you do have more questions on APRA that are outside of the records management, I always recommend reaching out to the Attorney General's office. They are the body that oversees that and offers the best advice and trainings for it. But I hope that the little bit I sped through about records management and how good records management helps with pretty much all day-to-day business, but even access to public records. I hope that's helpful, but if there's questions about compliance, that's outside of our scope, and I would recommend that you reach out to the AG's office. Okay. So I've sped through a good amount of content, and I really appreciate everything that you've already listened and gone through. So I'm just going to run through at this point some commonly asked questions that we tend to get, in hopes that it will cover any question that you may have had. But if not, obviously, I'm happy to answer any questions at the end if you think of anything I haven't covered just yet. So first and foremost, we get a lot of questions on why, right? So I've just spent a good 20 minutes explaining the central use of a retention schedule to you. But when we open the schedules and you see how many series there are, it can be very overwhelming and it can feel like that big why. It's like the elephant in the room, right? But the use of the retention schedules does two very core things outside of just the functionality of them. It, one, protects you in the agency, in the municipal office that you work for, and it helps create public confidence because it's very clear what you have, why you have it, and that it's being preserved properly. The retention schedule helps all of us be good custodians of the government records that we care for and use in our day-to-day work. So the records retention schedule and the destruction form work together to provide that clear evidence and legal processing of using and caring for public records. So the why is to help. Even though it seems maybe like it's not, it is. It is there to help you. And our office, importantly, is here to help you. So how the record series function is that they apply to physical and digital records. So again, it's based on the content, not the format of creation. But the series themselves can be separated into subseries with their own distinct retention periods. For example, the records retention schedule that has grant files on it. Grant files have successful and unsuccessful. So those are subseries A and B. So the maintenance of those records is going to be dependent upon if it was a successful application or an unsuccessful application. So that's why subseries can exist. When you're approaching a records retention schedule, regardless of how long or short it is, all that's really required is three, I put easy here, but I think simple is probably a better word. Three simple steps. Review each series, and then as you're going through, you locate the proper series for the records in question, right? For what you are looking to identify. And that's when you're going to want to be reading pretty thoroughly the description portion, which is the short paragraph after the title, because that tells you what it's there for, what the function of the record is, and it helps narrow down for you what the proper one is, which is item number 3 here, which is identify the retention. So on this slide, I've kind of broken out more clearly each of the different parts of a schedule. So this is an example with the subseries. So I'm going to use my mouse here really quick to drag over. So we have our record series title here, and then this paragraph is our record series description. And that's the part that's going to be the longest to read, but the most valuable from the sense of it will give you the confidence that you've identified the right record series for the record that you're looking to identify via the schedule. When we talk about the certification of records destruction form, the information that goes on that form is the record series number and title, and then the subseries if that's necessary, and then we double check that the retention has been met. So that the information from the schedule is what goes on that form. So this is the tool to identify based on the content what you have and then how to care for it. Another common question that we tend to see is what is a complete email record? Because email is a record creation tool, not one type of record. So if you are receiving an email, a complete record would be one that has the metadata, the actual email message, and the attachment, because it's a part of the holistic record that's being produced, either sent or received. An incomplete record would be a message without the metadata or the attachment without the email record. So it's that combination of the trifecta of all three things there. How do records retention schedules impact digitization is a very big question, and it actually depends on how long the retention of the record is. So if it's less than a 10-year retention, a pretty standard process and standard digital format, PDF, Word document should be okay. But if it's any longer than that, because of obsolescence and how quickly things can go obsolete and become illegible, you need to have a preservation format and a preservation plan in place to ensure that the record is readable for the entire life cycle. It's not just about keeping it, it has to also be readable. Those two things have to be true. If it's permanent, the actual requirement from a digitization perspective is microfilm, which, while it feels like an old technology, is actually still the most dependable. Microfilm can last 500 years, and all it requires is a stable environment and magnification to be able to read it, whereas digital files can again go obsolete between 2 to 5 years. If you look at the Library of Congress, they have a website that has all of the different file extensions that have ever existed so far, or pretty close to, and it is dozens and dozens of pages of just names of file extensions that we've never heard of because they've gone obsolete already. So using and understanding that things can go obsolete that way is why long-term digital preservation is more complex. But that does go back to earlier on when I was sharing about an access copy versus preservation. You could scan something for access and maintain the paper, and you always have that stable copy available to you. But for working copies, you can use a scan without having any difficulty as long as you're maintaining the paper. Which brings me to this question, which is it required to keep paper after digitizing? The answer is maybe. It depends on the length of the record. But I do firmly believe that the access copy is a really great middle ground of maintaining the preservation of your paper, but digitizing your workflow and having access to things in an easier pace if you need it on your computer, your shared drive, and those files that you use for day-to-day business. So why does it have to be kept? I covered this a minute ago, but just comes down to that digital is less stable. Digital is really fantastic for access, for speed, but it is not good for longevity. Paper lasts for hundreds of years in a stable environment. Digital is not at that point yet. So we don't discourage the use of digital. Obviously, we live in a digital world, but there's a lot to be said for, as custodians, the long-term preservation. Digital is not the most stable, at least not yet. So what is the best practice for permanent preservation or long-term when it comes to either born digital records or records that you are digitizing for long-term use? So file format conversion from a standard PDF to a PDFA, which stands for PDF archival, and from a JPEG or a PNG to larger video files, video or image files, excuse me. So TIFF, an uncompressed file, or a JPEG 2000. So all of those file formats are intended for long-term. But even with that, the 4 steps on this slide are also very integral to ensuring longevity. So periodically reading the files, double checking that they actually open and are usable. To migrate them as necessary. If you open a file, you recognize that it still opens, but some of it might be impacted in some way. You want to save as, right? So from a .doc to a .docx, migrate it forward so that it's preserved. You want to continually run virus and fixity checks. A fixity check is a digital archiving term for ensuring that none of the ones and zeros in the binary code slips and therefore corrupts the record. And last is that lots of copies keep stuff safe. Have a backup. Especially for long-term records, you want to have a backup of your digital records. So this question has come out of a lot of really great projects with our state agency partners, but I think is also relevant for any government agency of all different types. So what is data integrity and why care about it? Data integrity essentially is just ensuring that records as described are accurately described and are complete for identification so that you know what you have. So an inventory is a version of data integrity, right? Having an inventory of your records and making sure that that inventory has complete information, not just box number and a general summary, but a box number, the record series name, the date of creation has a lot more oomph to it in helping you manage your records than just a very generalized list that still requires a lot of deep access or pulling of boxes to identify what you have. And by ensuring that data integrity, it protects your agency, and it also just means that you're not playing whack-a-mole with your records and identifying what's in what box and where it is and what storage location it's at. So having integrity over your records just means, just from the very beginning of this presentation, knowing what you have and knowing where it is. By keeping that inventory, it helps with all of the things that have to do with future disposition. Knowing when it was created or received, knowing its series, knowing its date span, and its destruction eligibility means that when it's time for destruction, you're ready. This is a pretty big one. Can records be digitized or destroyed without an approved records retention schedule? And the answer to that is no, because a government record, as created, is considered permanent until otherwise identified. So an unscheduled record is automatically considered permanent until it is reviewed and placed onto a records retention schedule. And that's why we work so directly with all of our agency partners throughout the state, so that once it comes to our attention that there's a new record that needs to be put on a schedule, we work with you to do that to ensure. It's almost the opposite of your refrigerator, right? Refrigerator is when in doubt, throw it out. Records management, especially in government, is when in doubt, hold. You always want to know what you have before you do anything with it, and knowing what you have means knowing it on the schedule. So when are records eligible for destruction? You just calculate them one at a time. You locate the record series, confirm the record's description matches the description of what you're working with, and review the retention period. One of my favorite ways to calculate is there are online date calculators. Saves me from doing mental math, especially for weird retentions, rather than like a 1 or a 10 year, the 7 or the 25 year is also just good from a confidence measure to use that online date calculator to help you know, especially if you're doing like really close dates, right? So instead of a full calendar year, you want to do February 15th, 2010 to November 12th, 2022. You need to then know what the length of the retention is from that November date in 2022 if you wanted to destroy all of those things together. So know the date of your records and then calculate forward based on the retention listed in the schedule. How often should records be destroyed? Now, this is something that is based on your day-to-day business, but it really comes down to we recommend reviewing for preservation and destruction once a year. For some agencies, that's on calendar. For some agencies, that's on fiscal. But most of the time, people are also doing consistent records management, and we get CRDs submitted all throughout the year. But at a minimum, at least think about reviewing on the calendar or the fiscal year so that it's not a runaway records situation, so that you know what you have and you're not being overrun by the records later on. But as it says on the slide, don't destroy until you've received the countersigned form back from our office, because that's the authorization to move forward with destruction. And again, protects you and gives you that documentation that you need. Same goes for a digital file. It cannot be destroyed without the CRD because it's still a record. It doesn't matter that it was created digitally versus physically. Same standards still apply. Moving beyond our very quick Q&A that I ran through there, I just wanted to also highlight for you and everybody on the call the ongoing and annual services that we do as an office, because we are here to help, which I know is kind of like the ongoing joke, but we do mean it. Like genuinely, our office is here to help everyone achieve their best practice and to elevate and scaffold up and do the things that make your day-to-day business simpler and easier and more straightforward. So we set the records management regulations and standards, but that also means that we publish guidance documents that help, including screenshots, like how to achieve the things that I've broadly gone over today. We provide ongoing trainings like today, but we also do more specific ones, and we have specific webinars that are always available online. We review and approve the forms for proper destruction. We manage the local government records program so that we can provide the guidance and support from municipalities, not just state agencies. We do records management site visits if someone really wants, some on the ground advice and assessment to help whatever you need, right? Either see how to apply standards additionally or in a new way, or just sometimes we just need to be told we're doing okay, right? And we're happy to do that and offer that encouragement and help bring that records management and make it less scary. I think the idea of records management feels really onerous, but it is just a tool in your tool belt for your days to be simpler and for identifying and finding what you need to be less of a headache. And lastly, we offer updates and tips for day-to-day records care through newsletters, but we also do drop-in sessions. So we're just here to offer the information to help you towards success or just greater success. And these are my final reminders here. When in doubt, please keep it. Don't destroy anything you're not sure of. If it's not scheduled, reach out. We'll work with you to get it on a schedule, set a schedule for records maintenance, and then just know the content. You know the content of your records best. So we're here to help you care for what you care for. So I hope that was helpful to you. I feel like I really buzzed through that just about hour, Jen, but that's the whole presentation. So if you have any questions, or I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Perfect timing. I love it. Yeah, let's open it up for questions. If anybody has any, you can just take yourself off of mute. All right, I'm gonna use that as you were very thorough, Ashley.
That's fine. And if anybody doesn't want to ask a question, you can give me a call or send an email, and we're happy to help regardless.
Absolutely. And if you joined us late, I did record this session. So if you'd like to share it with your staff, I will be posting it to our YouTube channel later this afternoon. So thank you for joining us, Ashley. We certainly appreciate it. Love to, maybe do this on an ongoing basis with whatever updates that you might have. And folks, if you have other questions or suggestions for trainings, please feel free to let me know. One question here, will you be sharing the slides? I certainly can do that.
Yep, I'll send them.
Ashley can get them over to me, and yeah, I can get them to you. So I'm not sure I have everybody's email. So if you didn't get this invite directly from me, just shoot me an email, Jen Slattery, and I will respond with the slides. All
Right.
right. Thanks so much again, Ashley, and
Mhm.
thank you everyone for joining us. Have a
Have a
great
great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.